Oh boy, do we have a doozy for you today. Two of the best values going in the entire world when it comes to content creation. The Sony ZV-E10 Mark II and the newly released Canon R50V. Now, I bought both of these cameras with my wife's own money. Let's find out which one might be right for you. Now, this is a really exciting video for me to make because the ZV-E10 Mark II is going to give you the best image quality that Sony offers at this particular price. It is still a budget camera, but you get S-Log3 with 10-bit 422 and of course a fantastic lens selection, so you can buy lenses to your heart's content. There are literally hundreds of lenses for the Sony E-mount system. The Canon R50V, now we have an even cheaper camera than the ZV-E10 Mark II, but it can still do 10-bit 422 C-Log3, also does 4K 60, just like the ZV-E10, although a bigger crop on this one. We'll get into that in a bit, but most important of all, we are starting to see some real lenses here for the Canon R-mount APS-C system. Look at these two, these Sigma lenses, the 16mm f1.4, this is the 30mm, as well as a few others, which makes this Canon camera even more attractive. But speaking of attractive, let's go out in Handsome Alley and I will show you some side-by-side footage right out the gate of these two guys right here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is just use all automatic modes because a lot of beginners are going to want to see that. Then, of course, I will move in to the more manual modes and deal with that S-Log3, C-Log3, but let's go out and do the automatic right now. Oh, and I should give a shout out to Camera Canada and Sigma Canada. They loaned me some of the gear that I used to make this video. So if you're Canadian, trying to buy some camera gear, go shop at Camera Canada. Okay, so these are all auto settings, ZV-E10 Mark II, the Canon R50V, auto white balance, auto exposure. The Sony has chosen 1/48 for a shutter speed, and I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, so that makes a lot of sense to me. At f3.5, the lowest this kit lens will go. The Canon, on the other hand, is choosing f4, the lowest the kit lens will go, and a 1/25 shutter speed, which is a little too slow. So you'll see there's a little too much motion blur happening right here. Don't know why they chose that. It should be a little bit higher, but still looks pretty good. So which one looks better to you? I mean, in the screen, neither are perfect. I look a little pale in the Canon, but I look too red in the Sony LCD. So, you know, and normally I'm perfect, right? You know, David Beckham's always calling me, he's like, Benny, that's what he calls me. How can I be so gorgeous like you? I'm like, Dave, I was born with this. You know what I mean? Got to deal with it. Now, of course, these cameras are capable of so much more, so let's do a side-by-side using the log profiles, 10-bit 422 C-Log3 on the Canon, S-Log3 on the Sony. I am using the Leaming LUT for color conversion. This is a corrective LUT, not a stylized LUT, just to give me accurate colors. And as you can see, you can pretty much mix these two cameras together, even though different brands and different kit lenses. You can just use the log profiles and then color grade, but we can still do better by sticking on a magnificent lens, the Sigma 16mm f1.4 on both cameras. You get a nice shallow depth of field. The background is blurred out so you can focus on Mark's moneymaker. Look at that mug right there standing out from that nonsense in the back that you don't need to look at. And as you can see, once again, the cameras can be fairly closely matched. It is not exact, but it is certainly close enough for me to be able to use both of these cameras at different angles. Now, this Sigma 16 is the first lens that I would buy for the Canon R50V, and it is one of the first lenses that I would buy for the Sony. It's just the Sony has a couple of other options. The Yongnuo 16mm 1.8 for those on a budget, and the Sony 15mm f1.4, which is one of the best lenses I have ever tested. That is available as well for Sony. However, the sweet spot for a lot of people on the Sony system is still the 16 1.4. And where Canon doesn't really have anything to compete with this 16mm, that's why I would get this right away for something like this, a talking headshot, documentaries. You know, if you're trying to do interviews, you want to shoot in a studio, this is a great focal length. It is roughly 24 millimeters on the Sony ZV-E10 when it comes to full frame field of view equivalents because of the 1.5 times crop, and it's roughly 26 millimeters on the Canon because it's a 1.6 times crop. That's why with the side-by-side you saw out there, the Sony is a little bit wider with the same lens in the same location. And now let's compare the 4K 60 side by side, still shooting in the log profiles. Now the Canon is at a 1.5 times crop for the 4K 60, whereas the Sony has a 1.1 times crop. So I actually had to take 2 steps backwards to get the same framing for the Canon in this particular shot. So if you are going to shoot 4K 60, you do have to be aware there's an extra 1.5 times crop on top of your regular 4K 30 or 4K 24 footage. And for those of you curious, here is the 1080 footage side by side, certainly not as detailed as the 4K, but if you do need to shoot in 1080, this is what you're going to get. And 1080 is of course how you have to use both cameras if you want to shoot in 120 frames per second for that buttery smooth slow motion. So if you're shooting on a 4K timeline, you're going to have to upscale that 1080 footage, and you will notice a degradation in terms of image quality. Now let's do this studio shot and see how the cameras look. So I am using the Sigma 16mm f1.4 on both cameras. This is how I would use them in the studio, and you certainly can use them in the studio. And in fact, I have used them in the studio in this exact shot. Using the kit lens here on the Canon R50V at 14mm f4.0, this is what you're going to get, still using C-Log 3 and the Leeming LUT for color correction. This is the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II in the studio with the kit lens at 16mm f3.5 using the Leeming LUT for conversion. Now the Sony does have an advantage in a windy environment because it comes with a little wind muff that covers up the mic capsule. So if you're out in the elements and you have some wind, the Canon is not going to do as well for you as the Sony. And this is the sound of the internal microphone on the Canon R50V. Looking at the bodies of these cameras, you have 2 very small, compact, lightweight cameras. In fact, the weight is very, very close. 367 grams on the Canon on my scale and 366 grams for the Sony with no lenses attached. The Sony is a little bit smaller and it's a more dense camera, so it feels a little more robust than the Canon, and the grip is larger as well, so it is easier to hold, but no real complaints about the form factor or the way that these cameras feel. They are a plastic build, but they are still nice cameras. And neither camera is weather sealed, so you don't want to take these two out in the harsh elements. They both have a flip-out, fully articulating screen, and the screen is also touch-enabled, so you can control your settings from the screen. Now, the Canon does have a higher resolution LCD, 1.6 million dots versus the 1.036 million dots of the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. However, in real life, in real practice, when I am out in the sunshine, it is easier to see the Sony screen. You see more detail, even if you bump the exposure all the way up on the Canon screen to make it as bright as possible. The Sony screen just has more detail, at least to my eye. That was surprising. I thought on paper the Canon looks better, so in real life it would look better, but really, in real life, the Sony was a little easier to see. The Canon actually has 2 1/4 threads, one on the bottom for traditional use and another one on the grip, so you can use the camera in vertical style. I thought that was a cool touch. For the Sony, you're going to have to get a cage or you're going to have to get a tripod where you can do vertical resolution because there is no 1/4 built right in. The Sony has a mic jack, a headphone jack for monitoring your audio, a USB-C port for power and streaming, and you also have a micro HDMI port. You have a spot for your UHS 2 SD card there on the side, which I like. The Canon has a mic port, a headphone port, a port for a trigger release, a USB-C port for streaming and charging, and also a micro HDMI port. The spot for the SD card on the Canon is unfortunately on the bottom where the battery is, so if you have your camera on a tripod, you're going to have to take it off the tripod in order to change out your SD card. Both cameras feature a zoom rocker, so if you have a power zoom like the kit lens, you can control that with the zoom rocker. You can also do digital zooming with the zoom rocker, a live button on the Canon on top, and a button to lock all of your buttons. You also have an on-off switch, a thumb dial to control your settings, and you have a little place instead of the PASM dial. What you have is a multitude of options for video, like S and F, which is slow and fast, the movie mode, an aperture mode, an all automatic mode, and one mode for photos. On the Sony, besides the zoom rocker, you also have an on-off switch and a thumb dial as well. The way you go into the different modes is photo, video, and S&Q with a switch and a big red record button. It also has a C1 button on top, which is for the background defocus, which is a beginner-friendly mode. The S&Q on the Sony stands for slow and quick, as opposed to the Canon's S and F, which is slow and fast. These are just ways for the camera to do time lapses or slow motion in a different way than your traditional style. So you can go into that mode and play around with that if you'd like. Now, a lot of people are going to want to take these cameras out and about, so let's talk about stabilization. Ironically, even though they're billed as vlogging cameras, often they have no IBIS, no in-body image stabilization. They rely either on lens stabilization or electronic stabilization. Now, I don't think either camera does a really great job with just the lens stabilization, so you're going to want to use some form of electronic stabilization. The Canon has two levels, first level and enhanced, and Sony has one level of active stabilization, but you can also use the gyro data that is recorded to the SD card and smooth that out in a program like Catalyst Browse, Catalyst Prepare, or GyroFlow, and you will get excellent gimbal-like footage results. I usually use a crop of about 4 or 5%, and it comes out really great. Some people don't like using it because it's a process that takes a bit of time, especially depending on your computer's power. But let's go out vlogging with both kit lenses, and then I will switch to what I think is the best vlogging lens currently available for either of the two cameras. Let's switch to better lenses. For the Sony, I will go with the Sony 11mm f1.8, and for the Canon, I will use the Sigma 10 to 18 f2.8, and I will put it at 10mm. Here we go. Now, both cameras certainly can get away with the electronic stabilization as long as you're smooth with your movements. You're not being too herky-jerky out there. You don't need to be herky-jerky. You know what I mean? Be nice and smooth with your camera, and they should do just fine. I do love the extra addition of recording gyro data to the SD card in case I need to use it, because sometimes I have needed to use it. I've put on electronic stabilization. It's still not stable enough, and then I go out and I can fix it in Catalyst Browse, smooth out my footage. I do like that. Wish that was available on the Canon, but at least it has two levels of stabilization. Now let's talk about rolling shutter, and this is a big win for the Sony here. The Sony has been measured at 15 milliseconds for rolling shutter, and Josh Satin measured this one right here. I haven't measured it myself, but he said he got about 31 milliseconds for rolling shutter, and you definitely can see that the rolling shutter is much worse than the Sony. So if you're worried about your jello lines and your jiggly footage, then the Sony is going to do better. In terms of battery life, you are going to get significantly more runtime on the ZV-E10 Mark II. You can get about 130 minutes of record time in 4K on this little camera, which is really impressive. The Canon, you can usually get about 80 or 85 minutes. I find a 4K 24 recording, so certainly not as impressive as that Sony runtime. And I also experienced no overheating during the testing with these two cameras in 4K, 130 minutes until the battery died, no overheat warning light even on the ZV-E10 Mark II, and also the Canon no overheat warning light at all, and it ran its full 85 minutes. Now, I can't speak for your temperatures or your environment, but if you set the internal temp to high on both cameras, screen open, and you put it on a tripod, if you're in my environment, which is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius, then you should be fine. However, there is something important here. At the 2-hour mark, the camera stopped recording. It has a 2-hour limit for some reason. Because say if you connect this camera USB-C to external power and have a big SD card in there, theoretically you could record a lot longer than 2 hours, but you're going to have to restart every 2 hours. A quick note about autofocus. I use all of the different brands here on the channel, but the Sony and the Canon are really the only two brands that I fully trust when it comes to autofocus. Now, the Sony may have a little bit of an edge here. It can focus in really low light situations in very challenging environments a little bit better than the Canon, and its tracking of subjects is a smidge better as well. But this Canon is nothing to sneeze at. If you're worried about autofocus for either of these two cameras, no need to worry. The autofocus is fantastic. I should also mention, if you want an in-depth guide of the menus of either of these two cameras, check out Jason Herman's channel. I will link that down below. He's a friend of mine, and he does these fantastic, very detailed walkthroughs of the menu systems of both of these cameras. So check that out if you are getting one of these. Before I get into some major differences, let's talk about the fact that there's a lot in common with these two cameras. They are geared towards your content creator. You have 4K 60 in this one, 4K 60 in this one. The crop is bigger, as I said earlier, 1.5 times for 4K 60 on the Canon, 1.1 times on the Sony, but they are downsampled images, so you get a 6K readout downsampled into 4K, so you get a nice 4K image. 4K 30, 4K 24, or 4K 60 looks really good. Both cameras have a product showcase mode where it just focuses on the thing that is closest to the camera at the touch of a button. That is convenient for a lot of content creators. When you turn both cameras vertically, the icons will switch on the screen so that you can see your settings vertically. I think that is great for the people doing the TikToking and the booty popping. They both have power zoom kit lenses. The Canon one goes a little bit wider, 14 millimeters, but at a 1.6 times crop, that's about 22.4 millimeters full frame field of view, whereas the Sony at 16 millimeters gets you 24 millimeters field of view full frame equivalent, so a little bit wider on the Canon, but the Sony can go a lot tighter at 50 millimeters. So if you want background separation, you can zoom all the way into 50 millimeters on the Sony and at a lower aperture of f5.6. So that Sony 50 millimeter will get you about a 75 millimeter field of view full frame equivalent. This 30 can only get you about a 48 millimeter full frame field of view, and it's at f6.3 instead of 5.6. And to go along with log modes, you also have a plethora of color profiles and some fun modes for vlogging to get you more cinematic vlogs, where they will give you those black bars on the top and bottom and all kinds of different fun options. Let's get into some major differences between the two cameras, and we will start with photos. Now, they can both take wonderful photos. 26 megapixels for the ZV-E10 Mark II, 24 megapixels for the Canon R50V, and you can make the photos look virtually identical in post, so no worries about image quality. However, the Sony only has electronic shutter. You can take 11 frames per second in electronic shutter, no mechanical shutter of any kind. The Canon can take 15 frames per second in its fully electronic shutter, but it also has another mode, which is electronic front curtain shutter, which is its version of mechanical shutter, and that can take 12 frames per second. So if you are indoors and you're under different lighting conditions, you might notice some banding here on the Sony that you're not going to get on the Canon. So if I have to take one of the two cameras out to shoot photos and it's not going to be outdoors, then I am going to take this Canon. The Sony gives you more codec options. You can shoot 4K all-eye if you want on this camera. You can't do that on the Canon. However, what is really cool with the Canon is they have introduced false color here in this camera. So if you like using false color for your exposure, not on a monitor, but on the LCD itself on your camera, you can do that. That is not on the Sony. Now the next one is a big one for me and a giant drawback for the Canon R50V when I am using it with my monitors. If you are outputting to HDMI, you're going to have some trouble with the Canon R50V depending on how you use it. With the Sony, you can just run the HDMI cable in, get a clean feed, and manipulate your settings on your screen. On the Canon, you can do that, but you can't record to the SD card at the same time. So you have to go into a different mode to record to your SD card where you can see your image on your monitor with a clean feed, but the screen is blacked out on your Canon, so you can't adjust your settings. So if you want to see your settings on your camera to be able to adjust them and see your clean feed on your HDMI monitor, you actually have to record externally because you can't do it internally to the SD card. So I find that to be a huge pain in the butt. I like to set up my HDMI monitors, then adjust my settings so that it looks right, and then press record. So with the Canon, I have to do that, set up my settings on my HDMI monitor, then go back into the menu and switch to the setting where I can record it to my SD card and then see my clean feed. So I really find that to be quite cumbersome, and I wish that they could fix that somehow in a firmware update. So for me, the best thing to do is to hook it up so that I get a signal on my HDMI monitor. The screen is black on the Canon, but I can now record to the SD card. And if I want to change my settings, I change my settings on the camera and I see them here on the HDMI monitor. And then I can press the display to get rid of everything once I have set up my settings. Not ideal, but it is a workaround. So as you can see here, it's much more simple with the Sony. I just have my clean HDMI feed. I have my screen here still functional on the ZV-E10 Mark II, and I can press record and record internally while I'm doing all of this. Of course, I can get the info from this screen up on this monitor if that is what I want to do, but I do have to change the settings internally for that, but I like this the way it is. When it comes to live streaming, you actually have a bunch of options for these two cameras. You can do it the traditional way, go through the HDMI port, straightforward, nice and sensible, and that is kind of what I like to do with these two because there's a bunch of gotchas if you go through the USB-C for streaming, and you can do 4K streaming with both of these cameras through the USB-C. The Sony does it pretty well. The gotcha with the Sony is that you can't use log profiles or anything like that. You have to stream your 4K 30 with just the standard picture profile. It does look great, but you have to do that. You can't switch to another picture profile. Now, you can power the camera as well through the USB-C port as you are streaming, which is great. And you can also record internally to the SD card while you're doing all that. However, that will heat up the camera, and I find here in my environment, after about 50 minutes or an hour or so, it starts to overheat. So I always have one of these little Ulanzi fans with the spring right here. I hook that up to the back, plug in a USB-C power bank to this thing, and then this will go all day. I would also recommend this fan for the Canon if you are live streaming because the camera does heat up as you do that, and it's nice to have a failsafe. Now with the Canon, you can stream up to 4K 60 with this guy, but there are a bunch of limitations. You can't power the camera through the USB-C as you're streaming it in 4K. So if you want to stream in 4K, you're going to need a dummy battery to go into this camera because you can't draw any power from the USB-C as you're streaming in 4K. If you stream in 1080, then you can power the camera through the USB-C as you stream. And you can also not record to the SD card internally while you are live streaming through the USB-C. It is also a little quirky to get it to work with your streaming software. You have to press the live button and then go into your streaming software, open that up, set it up that way. And then if you want to change any settings, you have to close down your live streaming software while still having the camera plugged in, change the settings that way, then open up your live streaming software again. If you're switching from 1080 to 4K, you have to take out the USB-C plug, plug it back in. So there is a bunch of oddities when it comes to live streaming with this guy. So I would probably just stick to the regular HDMI streaming. The great news, though, is that if you figure out all those quirks and you're okay with them, you have a dummy battery going and you want to go in 4K, you can use this with C-Log 3 and then apply your own LUT in your streaming software. So it does give you more options for color profiles than the Sony, as long as you don't mind that little rigmarole. Now let's go to the east wing of my estate to do a low light comparison. Now both these cameras are going to do pretty good in low light because they have a Sigma 16mm f1.4. We'll start with this, then we'll go up to f4 so you can see what it would look like if your lens is f4 at its lowest aperture, like the kit lens from the Canon. Now, I think both cameras are going to be fine as long as you have a fast lens, something like a 1.4. Like, it was really dark back there. As long as you have any kind of light whatsoever and a lens that goes down to f1.4, think you're going to be fine in low light with either camera. Let's talk about not only price, but value for the money, because the R50V is definitely cheaper than the ZV-E10 Mark II, significantly cheaper. However, if you are looking at the ecosystem as a whole and you factor in things like lenses, you may pay less overall for the ZV-E10 Mark II's system. But let's talk about real numbers. What we have here is $650 for the body alone. $650, that is an excellent price for this camera, whereas the Sony comes in much higher at $1,000 USD for just the body alone. That is $350 more. If you're buying both cameras with the kit lenses, the price gap narrows a little bit. $100 extra for the kit lens on the Sony, so that's $1,100, but $200 extra for the kit lens on the R50V. So with kit lenses, you have $850 versus $1,100. Now it is $250 more expensive. But here's the thing. Sony has so many more lenses and so many more lens options when it comes to third-party manufacturers. Let me see. Of course, we know about the Sigma. You can buy that for similar prices for these two units. But this one right here, this is a Viltrox APS-C Air series. This thing is $176, and they have a bunch of different focal lengths for this Air series. You also have lenses like Yongnuo. This one I think is, what is this one? This is the 16mm, so this is less than $300, I believe, which is much cheaper than the Sigma 16. There is 7 Artisans, TT Artisans, Mikey, which is a fantastic value for lenses, and the list goes on and on. So you might pick up the body for this guy alone and then get a bunch of cheap lenses from third-party manufacturers that are great lenses and spend less money overall than the Canon. But if you're looking at bodies alone, features, what they are offering, I do think that the Canon offers a more compelling value if you're just judging the two cameras on their own, as long as you don't mind the quirks that come with this particular system, like the problems with the HDMI monitoring. But for a lot of people, especially at the entry-level market, this is going to be a gigantic hit. And of course, the ZV-E10 Mark II is already one of Sony's bestsellers. It is a way to get an excellent image quality, the same image quality you will get out of the A6700, which is their flagship hybrid camera, or their flagship video camera for APS-C, the FX30. Same exact sensor, so wonderful image quality for a much lower price. Now, personally, I think both cameras are fantastic, and the sky is the limit to what you can create with these two very well-priced, very capable cameras. But let me know down below what you think. Do you prefer one over the other? Are you already in one system? Is it too late for you now with Canon because they waited too long for third-party lenses? Let me know down below, and we'll have a nice little discussion about it. Thanks for watching this. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.